If you haven't taken a look at it, not a big deal because it's going to be pretty straightforward to do. So let's start at the top and work down. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read out each scenario. I want you to think like an appraiser in that scenario and tell me in that scenario what your bias is going to be, whether to push the value up or push the value down. That sounds mysterious. As I go through each scenario, the answers are going to kind of come through. Okay? So let me pick. Takuto, you can be my first guinea pig. You're valuing your own business for sale to a third person. You're going to overestimate your value. What are the tools you're going to use to push up the value? What are some of the techniques you can try? Okay, you try a lower discount rate. What else? You're a young business, so what's the other device you're going to use? Higher growth, bigger market. So if you're a person selling your own business, no surprise. You're going to try to push the value up. You're going to use higher revenue growth rates, higher cash flows, lower discount rates. Trivial, but file that away. Now let's play the role, Esteban, you be the venture capitalist trying to buy it. You're going to invest in his business. What's your bias going to be? To overestimate his value, underestimate his value, or you underestimate the value? Tell me why. It's not that you want to pay a low price, because you actually are going to invest the same amount, $1 million, but what do you get in return? A share of his business. You know what that share is based on? Whatever you estimate the value to be. So if you estimate a lower value, you get a bigger chunk of his business. So what are the techniques you're going to use to push his value down? So when he says revenue growth is going to be 60%, you're going to say it's 20% or 30%. Start low. You know you're going to end up at 40, start at 20, right? Then once you come up with the value, you know what venture capital is? You know how venture capitalists value businesses? They project out the revenues 3 years from now. They value the businesses 3 years from now. Then what do they do to that value? They bring it back to the present using not so much a discount rate, but what they call a target rate. This is what I need to make. And guess what you're going to use as a target rate, a low number or a high number? So when you see VCs, they say, I want to make 60%. You know they're lying. You know why we know they're lying? Because if you look at after the fact what they make as returns on their investments, they end up with 13, 14, 15%. So they tell you, we're going to make 60% on these angel businesses because that's what we need to make. It's a device you're going to use to push the value down. Let's keep going. You're valuing your own business for divorce court. Half of that value is going to end up with your spouse, soon to be ex-spouse. What's your bias going to be? My business is worth nothing. Half of nothing is nothing. Take it. Okay? So no surprise again there. You are valuing your business for giving up half of it. You're going to come up with a low value. Let's build on that. You're an appraiser for the owner of a business. You're valuing the business for tax purposes. Very specific. So whatever the value of your business is, I might take away 20, 25. It might be a state tax. It might be some other tax. So what's your bias going to be? To come up with a low value, right? Again, using a lower cash flows, higher growth rate. And in private business, there is this very deceptive device used at the very end of the process where they attach what's called an illiquidity discount. The basis for this discount is actually very intuitive. You're saying, this is a private business. I have to worry about liquidity, so I have to knock off a portion of that value for liquidity. I mean, that makes sense, right? But then why 30% as opposed to 20%? 40% as opposed to 30%? So if you're an appraiser of a private business, you're appraising the value for tax purposes. No surprise, you're going to come up with a low value. But if you're the appraiser for the IRS, you want to come up with a high value. And here's the problem with the legal system. It has absolutely no sense. So here's what happens in court. The expert witness for the private business comes in with a number. The appraiser for the IRS comes in with a higher number. And courts, being what they are, do what? They split the difference. Now do you see why the effect of this is going to make valuations even worse on both sides? Because if you know they're going to split the difference, both sides are going to go to extreme positions. It happens all the time. Let's go to 5. You're a sell-side equity research analyst valuing a company to put a buy or a sell recommendation on the company. Okay? Bruce, what's the bias going to be there? Tell me why, though. It's a little more subtle. Tell me what you gain by putting a high value on it. Okay, so let's first, as a sell-side equity research analyst, there are three groups of people you're serving, right? One is, of course, the investors that you're supposedly sending these equity research reports for. Don't forget that. That's ultimately, one of the clients. The second, of course, are the companies that you track. They're not your, you're not serving them in the traditional sense, but you've got to have good relations with them. And the third, of course, is the investment bank you work for, which might have other business with the company. So you're juggling three balls in the air. You have to try to keep all three groups reasonably happy. I don't envy your job. The net effect, I think you're right, is to induce you to put out more buy than sell recommendations, to push up the value, because it makes your life easier. Are you going to piss off one of the three groups, though, by doing this? If you're consistently overestimating value, putting out buy recommendation after buy recommendation, one of these three groups is going to be pissed off, right? And which group is that? Your investors. So you know what you're already telling me. That's the group I care about least among these three, because the consequences of pissing them off doesn't seem to be as large. Maybe things are changing, but that's something we're going to come back to and talk about in this class, because it is actually an issue that we have to deal with. Okay? Now let's get to M&A. This is where valuations go to die. So let's see why. Okay? So here's what we're going to do. Okay? You guys are going to be you're going to work for the acquiring company. You guys are going to work for the target company. Okay? So your investment bankers for the target, your investment bankers for the acquiring company. This is going to be a friendly merger, which means what? It basically means you want this deal to go through. Both sides. Okay? So there are four of you in this room. You know who the four of you are? The CEO of the acquiring company, the CEO of the target company, the investment bank for the target company, the investment bank for the acquiring company. And what are you talking about? What can we do to make this deal go through? Right? So let's say you're the investment banker for the acquiring company. What's the group you've got to convince that this deal is a good deal? It's your shareholders. It's your own shareholders and the directors of the company. And how do you convince them it's a good deal? You have to convince them that the value of the target company is much greater than what you're paying for it, right? So your bias is to push the value up, saying, hey, look, this is a great deal. See, what's the big issue there? Now, let's say you're the investment bankers of the target company, right? What do you have to do? You got to convince your shareholders that this deal is a great deal. And to do that, what do you have to show them? That the price they're paying is far greater than your value as a company. So you want to push the value down. You say, how do you pull this off? The price is the price. How can it be too low for one side and too high for the other? This is where bias kicks in. You're going to see two valuations float out of that process with very different numbers because you have two very different groups to keep happy. Now let's make this a hostile acquisition. Okay? Still, you're going to be the investment bankers for the acquiring company, investment bankers for the target company. In a hostile acquisition, the game changes. There's only one group that you're playing to in a hostile acquisition. It's the shareholders of the target company. That's all, because you're fighting between the two of you, because you have two very different interests. So as the investment banker for the acquiring company, what do you have to convince the target company you're doing? You've got to convince them that you're paying far more than their company's worth, that this is in fact a good deal for them. So already you can see that if you're the investment banker for the acquiring company in a hostile acquisition, you want to actually come in with a low value, at least for public consumption, because you want the shareholders in that company to say, hey, this is a great deal. And now your role is reversed. What do you have to convince your stockholders? Because you work for the target company's managers who don't want this deal to go through. You now have to push up the value, saying, that price is not high enough. So this might sound like a silly thing to do, but when you look at evaluation, step back and see why it's being done. Who is it being done for? Let's keep going. You're a buy-side analyst. You know what the contrast between a sell-side and a buy-side analyst is? Sell-side analysts are the ones who work for the investment banks. Most of the analysts you run into in New York are sell-side analysts. They work for investment banks. They provide research, but it's not for their internal use, but for outside consumption. Buy-side analysts work for mutual funds, work for investors, private equity investors, or whatever investor is, and their research is for internal consumption alone. There should be a little less bias being a buy-side than a sell-side analyst, right? Because you don't have these different groups to keep happy. But let's say you're a buy-side analyst valuing a company for your portfolio manager. Remember, you work for the portfolio managers in your company. So if you're a Fidelity buy-side analyst, your primary group is those portfolio managers. You're valuing a company for a portfolio manager who already happens to own 1 million shares of this company. So you finish the valuation and you look at that number. What's going to make your life easier? A high number for the company or a low number for the company? If you come in with a low number for the company, what are you telling this guy? You shouldn't be owning this Apple stock. It looks vastly overvalued, right? And is he going to take this in a friendly way? So that's very good that you told me right now. He's going to fight you every step of the way, right? So your life is a lot easier if you come in with a high value. And conversely, if he's sold short in a company, it's always nice to tell him, hey, you did the right thing. So what I'm trying to say is in most valuations, we maintain this illusion that we're objective. My advice is strip yourself of that illusion. We're all biased. Might as well be honest about your biases, at least to yourself. You might not be honest with your colleagues, you might not be honest with your clients, but be honest with yourself. In statistics, there's a branch of statistics called Bayesian statistics. You know what you're supposed to do in Bayesian statistics? You're supposed to reveal your priors before you do something. So if you're going to do research, you have to tell me before you do the study what you expect to find out of the study. So if you say, I'm going to study this, but you know what, I think this is what I'm going to find. You're saying, that's backwards. Why would you do that? Because Bayesian statistics says that if I read the results you come up with, they're much more useful if I can read them in conjunction with your prior. So if you tell me you're going to find something in a study and you find it, I'm not as impressed. But if you find me, in fact, last week there was a study that came out that looked at these near starvation diets and whether your lifespan would be increased. And you know what impressed me most about the study? Is the people running the study actually thought they were going to find confirmation. They thought that if they could feed, I don't know, monkeys or whatever they were feeding starvation diets, that they would live longer. But they discovered that they did not. That to me was much more persuasive than if they'd come out and said, hey, we found that starvation diets extend your life. So maybe there should be something similar in valuation where we reveal our priors before we do valuation. And here's where we can start. You guys have started to think about the companies you're going to value? Some of you might have already picked a company to value. Here's what I'd like you to do before you look at a 10K or an annual report. Some of you might have already finished your valuation. I'm impressed. But in case you haven't done anything other than pick your company, when you pick your company, I'd like you to write on a sheet of paper or on your computer, somewhere safe where you can record it, what you think you're going to find in your valuation. That you think you're going to find that the company's undervalued or overvalued. Write it down, save it. Then at the end of the process, let's go back and see if there's a correlation between what you thought you were going to find with the company and what you actually found. I'll make a prediction. There will be a very high positive correlation between what you think you're going to find and what you find. It's the nature of the process. So keep that in mind as we go through this. One final thing about bias. There's this notion of fair value that's riding through a lot of stuff. Accounting, for instance, is starting to become focused on fair value accounting. A lot of M&A deals, you have to do that fair value. Somebody's got to sign off, this is a fair value. Now clearly you can see that fair value, at least as it's defined in practice, is practically useless. Because it really depends on who do you work for. Who paid you to sign this document? So I'm going to give you my definition of fair value and you tell me what you think about it. My definition of fair value is if you give me that value, you got to be willing to buy at that price, but you also have to be willing to sell at that price. If I were running a tax authority, if I consistently ran into this problem of appraisals for value coming in much lower than they should be, I have a very simple way of fixing that, though it might require legal backing and financial backing. And here's what I would change. I would tell you, look, you can, as a taxpayer, give me whatever estimate of value you want for your business, but here's what I have the right to do as the tax guy. I have the right to buy your business from you at whatever your appraised value is. You know how quickly that'll stop under appraisals? Because all I have to do is take 1 out of every 10 business, say, hey, you told me your business was worth only $1 million. I'll buy it from you for $1 million. All of a sudden, the appraiser is going to go back. No, that's not what I intended this for. But that's going to bring the bias out in the process. So you're telling me you have 3 different values depending on why you're doing the valuation. So the reason I've kind of spent so much time on these 3 issues, bias, uncertainty, and complexity, is they kind of underlie so much of what you do in valuation. Okay? So let's go back to the slide we left off with on hopefully you've had a chance to get the lecture note package. So this is the first lecture. This is we're not at the lecture note package yet. We're in the introduction, the valuation introduction, but we will get to the lecture note package later today. So we're on page 4. I'm sorry. So we're on the 4th page of the introduction packet, which I gave out last session. If you don't have it, just track along. It's not a big deal. So we talked about valuations being biased. We talked about uncertainty in valuation. And we talked about complexity. A couple of closing thoughts on complexity. Okay? I have a very simple motto when it comes to valuations. Less is more. Do not add any more detail than you absolutely have to. The physical sciences, there's a principle called the principle of parsimony. You know what the principle of parsimony is? When you're trying to explain a phenomenon, you start with the simplest possible explanation for it before you make yourself Einstein. We have to adopt a similar principle when it comes to valuation. When you're trying to value something, start with the simplest model you can get away with. If you can value a company with 3 inputs, don't value it 5. If you can value a company with 2 years of forecast, don't do 10. You're saying, what's the cost? So what's the big deal if I do an extra 8 years? Because you have to make estimates, and you're doing them for no reason at all. You're adding noise to the process when you don't have to. We talked about complex models last session, and we talked about the costs of complex models, that basically they become black boxes, and you have this input fatigue. You can mangle some really simple assets using complex models. And I'll give you my favorite example. It's an asset that every company has on its balance sheet. The simplest of all assets to value. What am I talking about? Cash, right? Cash should be the simplest of all assets to value. Every week I get at least a half a dozen emails from people I don't know. I get a lot more from people I don't know, but these half a dozen are very specific. They claim to have built a better model to value cash, and they want me to take a look at the model. So here's how the emails will begin. Professor Deodorant. Amazing what Microsoft Word does to your name, right? Spell check. Hey, at least I smell good. It could be a lot worse, right? Professor Doo-Doo, whatever, you know. I have spent the last 6 months of my life building this model to value cash, to which my first reaction is, what an empty life you must have. So there'll be this extended email. At the bottom they'll say, could you please take a look at the attached valuation model I've built to value cash? Little Excel spreadsheet at the bottom attached saying cashvaluation.xls. I don't even try to open the spreadsheet. I'd be crazy to. I mean, I don't know what viruses lurk in there. This could be a Nigerian spreadsheet for all I know. But I've actually programmed the F7 key on my laptop to respond to these emails. I hit it. You know what it says? Have you tried counting it? It works with cash, 20, 40, 68. You don't need a model to value cash. Because you know what happens when people build models to value cash? They screw it up big time. Let's take an example. It's the company with the largest cash balance in the world. Oh, come on, you don't even have to think about it. Apple, 100 billion plus, 120 billion right now. Now, when you see cash and marketable securities in the balance sheet of a US or a European company, where is it usually invested? What does it have to be invested in to qualify as cash and marketable securities? It's got to be invested in liquid and close to riskless. I won't even say riskless because that might be too high a threshold to meet nowadays. Liquid and close to riskless, which means that that cash is invested where? Commercial paper, T-bills, short. And right now, what do you think it's making? Maybe if you're lucky, 0.5%. Let's round it up to 1%. So you have 100 billion in cash invested earning 1%. So here's what you do when you build models to value cash. You project the income from the cash. And the minute you project the income, all is lost, because then the Pavlovian response kicks in. When I'm talking about this is the response that you go back to business school to pick up, which is when you project numbers into the future, what are you trained to do? You got to discount them, right? And to discount them, what do you need? You need a discount rate. And you remember your corporate finance class, your valuation class, you pull the books out, cost of equity, cost of capital, arbitrage, pricing model, you plug and you chug and you come up with a 10% cost of capital for Apple. You're celebrating, man, my MBA paid off 10% cost of capital. So let's see where we are. You have 100 billion in cash invested risklessly, making 1% a year. You project the income from the cash, you discount it back at a 10% cost of capital. What do you think is going to happen to 100 billion in cash? It's going to become 80 billion. You want to show me cash is worthless? Use a 50% cost of capital. It's amazing how quickly you can wipe out billions of dollars in cash. And it's happening only because you chose the wrong discount rate. You're saying, what a dummy, I would never do something like that. If you've ever estimated cash flows for a company starting with net income, you just did that, right? You see why? Where does the income from cash go? It goes into net income. If you use net income to come up with cash flows, you come up with the cash flow to equity, you discounted the cost of equity, you just did what I did in a much more complicated way. It happens all the time, and it happens because you're looking for trouble. So here's my rule for detail. If you're looking and say, should I break this item down? Ask yourself a follow-up question. Do I have the information? Is there something I can bring into the valuation by breaking it down? The answer is no, don't do it. I'll give you a very simple example of something I do in valuation to kind of illustrate this process. You know what the full breakdown for working capital is, right? It's accounts receivable, inventory. So basically, you can have working capital broken down into 6, 7, 8 items. I have never, ever done a valuation where I've broken down working capital down into individual items. You know why? Because I have a tough enough time projecting out what accounts receivable will be for the next quarter. I don't want to do it for the next 30 years. By aggregating, sometimes you make your life easier. And the more uncertain you feel, the more you should aggregate. So one of the great ironies you're going to see is, as we look at high growth companies, where there's more uncertainty, you'll see fewer line items in my valuation, which sounds weird. You're saying, for more uncertainty, I want to have more detail. Fight the urge. Keep it simple. So that's not to say you're not going to see models that are complex, but every layer that you add, you have to ask yourself, can I gain something by adding that layer? If the answer is no, don't do it. There's no point in showing off just for the sake of showing off. Okay? You can have your own intimidation spreadsheets if you want that other people use, but internally have a much simpler spreadsheet where you value the company based on fewer line items. So now let's lay the table for what's coming in this class. Ultimately, when you look at all of the different valuation models, metrics out there, they can fall into one of 3 buckets. The first is intrinsic valuation. Sounds fancy, right? Intrinsic valuation, you value an asset based on its own characteristics. So that's what's the value of this? You just value it based on its own cash flows, its own growth, its own risk. As I mentioned in the first class, much of the valuation that you see out there is relative valuation. You value an asset based on how similar assets are priced out there. That's what I call pricing. And the third layer to valuation is contingent claim valuation. Rather than value a company based on expected cash flows, you value it as an option. I'm going to argue that every valuation approach you see out there has to go into one of these 3 buckets. Let me ask you a question, and this is kind of an open question for those of you who've done valuation. Can you think of valuation approaches I've missed? It's a loaded question because I've said I haven't missed anything, but I might have. What about liquidation valuation? Let me play devil's advocate. Why isn't that a fourth way of doing valuation? What's liquidation valuation? What do? You stop the company right now, you take each asset and you value each asset separately. Right? See, that's a fourth way of doing valuation, but how do you come up with the value of each asset? So let's say you're a real estate company with 5 real estate holdings. What do? You value each real estate holding individually. And to value each holding, what do you have to do? You either have to use a discounted cash flow model or a relative valuation model, or maybe an option pricing model. Liquidation valuation is a valuation task you might have, but it's not a valuation approach. How about sum of the parts valuation? What's sum of the parts valuation? Can somebody give me an example? To value Apple, this is the sum of its parts. How would I value it? First, I take the iPhone and value the iPhone franchise and the iPad and the MacBook franchise and the iTunes. So basically, I could take everything they do and value them separately, add them all up and say, this is the sum of the parts valuation. But there again, you run into an issue. How do you value the iPhone's franchise, the iPad? You either have to use. So don't mix up the task you have in valuation, which might be to value a company for an acquisition, to value it for legal purposes, to value it for accounting, with the valuation approach. So what I'd like to do is at least lay the foundations for these basic approaches. And before I do that, I have to make a confession. After you've gone through enough finance classes, one of the issues that every class has to kind of confront is this issue of efficient markets. And often I'm asked whether I believe in efficient markets, and my response is a very simple one. If I believed that markets were efficient, would I be teaching this class? And that sounds like a strange answer, right? Or a strange question to a question. If I believe markets were truly efficient, what is the best estimate of the value for Procter & Gamble? Just open up the Wall Street Journal, look up the price today. There would be no point to doing valuation, for the most part, if I believe markets are efficient. What I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is, the minute you sit down to value a company, you've already made a decision that markets are inefficient. You can find those inefficiencies and make money off them. It might be a complete illusion. But when you do valuation, you are beginning with the presumption that markets make mistakes. But here's what's different about the 3 approaches. You're making different assumptions about the ways markets make mistakes and the ways they correct them. So with each approach, I'm going to talk about what the underlying inefficiency assumption has to be for this approach to work and for you to make money. So let's start with intrinsic valuation, which in most cases shows up as discounted cash flow valuation. Discounted cash flow valuation, the value of any asset, is the present value of the expected cash flows on that asset. That's it. There is no theory here. That's all. The theory is by the present value equation. Everything in valuation is an estimation challenge. The theory is kind of non-existent. It's a present value equation. And when you do discounted cash flow valuation, you're starting off with a philosophical belief that every business, every asset, every company has an intrinsic value, and that you can find it. But here's the problem. I firmly believe that every asset has an intrinsic value. I also firmly believe that none of us will ever get to see it. So in discounted cash flow valuation, discounted cash flow valuation generally is a little bit like the search for the Holy Grail. You know you'll never find it, but the fun is in the looking. Basically, what you learn from discounted cash flow valuation comes out from the process of valuing a company, not the end number. But you start off with that belief that everything has an intrinsic value, and you can try to estimate it. And if you break discounted cash flow valuation models down, all discounted cash flow models, no matter how complex they are, have 3 ingredients. They obviously have cash flows. They have a life for the asset. So if you give me a building that's going to last 20 years, I estimate cash flows for 20 years, and they have a discount rate to discount those cash flows. That's it. Don't make it any more complicated than it has to be. But let's close the sale. I don't know about you, but I don't do valuation because I'm intellectually curious. I don't lie awake at night and say, I wonder what Google is worth right now. Maybe you do, but then you have a serious sickness, get it treated right away. I do valuation for one reason and one reason alone, which is I'm greedy. I want to make money. So let's see what the pieces of the puzzle have to be for you to make money off your own valuations. First, you have to assume that markets make mistakes. Reasonable assumption? Absolutely. I don't think you'll find a single person in the world who will disagree with. Even the firmest believer in efficient markets will concede to that markets make mistakes, and sometimes they make some really big mistakes. So that's easy. Second, you have to assume you can find those mistakes with your metrics and models. Now we're on dangerous ground, right? Why? What's the track record of people who claim to find market mistakes? Let me reframe the question. Remind me again how much the average active portfolio manager beats the S&P 500 by each year. Anybody want to try? How much does the average active portfolio manager beat the index by each year? It's a trick question because the average active portfolio manager delivers about 1 to 1.5% less than the S&P 500. So it's the strangest profession if you think about it. There is no other profession you could get away with this on this record. It's like, I mean, I'll give you the analogy. It's like starting a plumbing business called Floods Are Us. And here's what you do. There's a leak in your house. You call me and I leave a flood. There's no way I'll be in business for the next 2 months, right? But that's what portfolio managers do. They take your money to do what? Collectively deliver 1% less than you could have made by not paying that money. Go figure. But that's a different challenge. Why do people use active portfolio managers? But it's tough to beat the market. It's not impossible, but it's tough. But let's say you're the special one. You found a metric or model that actually works, and let's give the mistake a name. Let's call it Cisco. Stock is at what, $20 right now? Let's say you do a valuation of Cisco. You think its worst days are behind it now. It's turned the corner. And you come up with a value of $35, and let's say you're right. It should really be worth, it should be trading at 35, it's trading at 20. So you found a market mistake, right? So you go buy 1 million shares of Cisco at 20. Have you made any money yet? What's the third assumption you need to actually make money off your valuation? What does the market have to do? It has to correct its mistakes. And how do you get it to correct its mistake? You can go on the Yahoo Finance message board and keep posting. Cisco's worth 35, Cisco's worth 35, but nobody's listening to you. They think you're crazy. You could try rumors. I mean, basically, the problem here is it's one of the great frustrations in valuation. You can be right, and you can go bankrupt being right. Your neighbor can pick stocks based on astrological signs and make millions. There's no justice in this world. And don't expect justice. That's why equity arbitrage is an oxymoron. Fixed income arbitrage is feasible, right? Why? Because there's a day of reckoning. The bond comes due. If it's mispriced, you lock in your profits. You can have a stock that is undervalued. You can buy the stock, and guess what? It can keep going down for the next 3 years, the 4 years, next 5 years. There is no day of reckoning. But here's the consolation prize. If you're right in your valuation, the longer your time horizon, the greater the chance, even though I can't guarantee it, the greater the chance that the market will come around to your point of view. But because eventually the truth wins out. But it eventually could take 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I've given away the hidden ingredient you need for discounted cash flow valuation to work for you. What is it? You need a long time horizon. Now remember, I started this class by saying most valuations out there are not intrinsic valuations. Now do you see why? What's the time horizon of an average portfolio manager or an average investor? 3 months, 6 months. And if you tell me your time horizon is 6 months, and you ask me, should I be doing discounted cash flow valuation? I have a very simple answer. Don't waste your time. Not because you can't do valuation, but because you're not giving the market enough time to fix its mistakes. So if you break DCF models down, here to me is the advantage of discounted cash flow valuation. And I'll make a confession up front. My bias is towards discounted cash flow valuation. I like it, and here's why. To value a company correctly, and that's the key word is correctly, with a discounted cash flow model, I have to understand the company. I mean, one of the things Warren Buffett has often said, you don't buy stocks, you buy businesses. If you buy into that message that you're not buying a stock in a company, you're buying a business, discounted cash flow valuation is closest to that notion of the word. You're valuing the business. It forces you to look at the insides of the business if you do it right. So because it's based on fundamentals, it's based on the company, you're immunized, not completely immunized, but you're relatively immunized to market moods and market perceptions. You don't care about them. You're valuing this business as is. Those are the advantages. Those same advantages are also its disadvantages. And here's why. You're immunized from the market mood, right? Because you're immunized from the market mood, you can come up with values that are very different from the price. And if your job is to reflect the market mood in the numbers, you're an equity research analyst, you're an M&A analyst, your job is to value the company given what other people pay today, intrinsic valuation might not do it. And it is true, intrinsic valuation can be more work than relative valuation. More inputs. And also make a statement that I think might sound strange. I'm a believer in discounted cash flow valuation, but I'd rather have a relative valuation than a badly done discounted cash flow valuation. You can do some real damage with bad discounted cash flow valuations. And the bad news is there are a lot of very bad discounted cash flow valuations. There's a reason people are skeptical about discounted cash flow models, because most people who do discounted cash flow valuation ignore internal consistency issues. They ignore basic laws of economics and mathematics. And one of the missions in this class is to kind of talk about how do you keep your discounted cash flow valuation disciplined and consistent. Because if you do, I think it gives you a chance to understand the business. One final issue. If you use discounted cash flow valuation to value companies, could you find every company in a market to be overvalued? Sure. Every company in a sector could be overvalued. You could look at every social media company and say, so what, big deal. If your job is to invest in equities, you're an equity mutual fund manager. See how difficult this makes your life? If I come and say, that stock is overvalued, so you're going to end up 100% in cash and you're going to get fired. Given your job description, intrinsic valuation might not be right for you. So the reason I'm going to talk about relative valuation is not as an inferior way of thinking about valuation, but as a different way of thinking about valuation, because in relative valuation, you get a chance to bring in market moods and reflect what your job is. But let's sum up on discounted cash flow valuation. To do discounted cash flow valuation then, it works best if you're valuing assets that generate cash flows. See, what kind of assets don't generate cash flows? Well, a collectible, a baseball card, for instance. So I ask you, what's an intrinsic, there's no intrinsic value. We talked about gold. Very difficult to even think of what the intrinsic value is. And a couple of days ago, I think over the weekend, there was the New York Times Magazine had this question about what is a $4,000 suit worth? Did you read that? I read the question and said, is this a trick question? But if you think about it, we know what the price of a $4,000 suit is. It's $4,000. So the question is asking, what is the intrinsic value? And the problem is there is no intrinsic value. To me, a $4,000 suit is worth nothing because I hate suits. I don't need to wear them. But for somebody who cares about how they look and they have a job, it might be worth $10,000. So you can't use discounted cash flow valuation for assets that don't generate cash flows. And if you're an investor and ask me, is discounted cash flow valuation right for me? I'm going to look for two things that will make it work for you. One is a long time horizon. And I'm not going to ask you the question, do you have a long time horizon? That's a stupid question. Because you know what you're going to say? I have a really long time horizon. Because you know that's the right thing to say. Because that's what investors do, right? Speculators are the ones who say, that's a bad thing, so I have to tell people. So I'm going to ask you, how much cash do you have? What's your income? You say, this is very personal. You know why that affects your liquidity, right? Your time horizon is not something you just pick. It's a function of the external environment. So if you're in a job where you're uncertain about your future, your time horizon gets shortened. So you need a long time horizon. And the second thing that would really help is, remember that third assumption that the price has to move towards the value? It would be nice if you can provide a catalyst to make the price move. A legal catalyst. Let me be quite clear about this. What am I talking about? Bill Ackman took a position in Procter & Gamble, right? But he has an advantage over you and I, because right after he takes a position, what does he do? He gets really loud about the position. I took this position. I'm going to change the company. And it's not just because he likes to hear himself talk, but what's he trying to do? He's trying to get the market price to start moving towards a value. That's the advantage that activist investors have over passive investors. Not active, but activists, where they actually try to make changes in the company. So if you're a private equity investor, a KKR or Blackstone, you have an advantage over a Fidelity Mutual Fund, which might have just as much money, because you might be able to provide that catalyst that makes the price move towards the value. So discounted cash flow valuation is not for everybody. And even if it's not right for you, you need to understand it to use the other approaches. Okay? So we're going to go through extended discussions of the discounted cash flow model. But at the end of the process, if you say, this isn't right for me, given my job, given my time horizon, given what I do, that's fine. Set it to the side, but at least you understand the bones of what else you're going to be doing as an alternative. So let's talk about relative valuation. Relative valuation, you value an asset based on how similar assets are priced out there. And in relative valuation, philosophically, you've given up on the notion of intrinsic value. So I don't know what the intrinsic value is. I'm going to let the market tell me what something is worth. And if you break down relative valuation models down, here are the three ingredients you're going to see. First, you're going to see either an identical asset or similar assets. And similar has to be put in quotes because you're going to be stretching the definition of similar. You're going to see a standardized price. What the heck am I talking about? You cannot compare the price per share across different companies, right? Because if I define price per share across companies, what's the most expensive company in the US? Berkshire Hathaway. 6 digits. What's the cheapest company? All those penny stocks. So if you say, I'm going to buy cheap stocks, and you define cheap as low price, you're going to end up with 1,000 penny stocks that are worth nothing, right? So you know what we do? We divide the price by something to standardize it. Sounds fancy, right? Divide the price by earnings, price by book, price. Multiples are just standardized prices. And we do it because if we did not do it, you could not compare across assets. And after we've got these similar stocks, we've got the multiple, then if we're careful, we realize they're not quite similar, and we try to control for the differences with a story. My stock has a lower PE ratio than the rest of the market, but that's okay because it's less risky. My company has a higher PE ratio than every other company in the sector, but that's okay because it has higher growth. So it's coming up with comparables, coming up with a standardized price, telling a story. And in relative valuation, do you believe that markets make mistakes? Yes and no. Let me do the no part first. You believe actually that markets are right on average. That's the essence of relative valuation. You say, look, markets make mistakes in individual steel companies, but collectively it must be right across steel companies. So the assumption you make about market mistakes is different in relative valuation and intrinsic valuation because you're judging it against the sector. So in relative valuation, it's not like you're assuming markets don't make mistakes, but they make mistakes in individual stocks that are right on average. So let's talk about the advantages of relative valuation. You're going to see that it's the flip side of intrinsic valuation. The biggest advantage of relative valuation is it reflects the market mood. Didn't I say that was the biggest advantage of discounted cash flow valuation was it does not reflect the market mood? With relative valuation, the fact that it reflects the market mood becomes its biggest advantage. Why? Because your job might require you to do that. So if I am a social media company, Pandora, at their IPO, and I came to you and said, value me, and you did an intrinsic valuation, say, you know what, based on the intrinsic valuation, you're worth nothing. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the next investment banker, because I didn't come to you and ask what my intrinsic value was. I basically said, I want to go public. What's the best price you can deliver for me? And the fact that everybody's optimistic about social media companies is none of your business. You take that optimism, you get the best price you can. You're not being unethical. You're doing your job. Your job is to price the company. So if your job is to do pricing, relative valuation is what you're going to use. And if you're judged on a relative basis, it gets even better, right? What am I talking about? Every year when Morningstar ranks portfolio managers, mutual funds, what does it do? It doesn't rank them against an absolute value. It ranks growth managers against other growth managers, value managers against other value. You're judged against the rest of the market, which means the name of the game is not whether you make money or whether you make good returns, but whether you make better returns than everybody else. So if you lose 20% of your portfolio, it looks bad until I compare you to everybody else, and they've lost 35%. So if you're judged on a relative basis, you can see why multiples and comparables are much more attractive to you. So it's no surprise to me that so many people use multiples and comparables. It fits their job, it fits the way they're judged, and it does take a lot less information to do a relative valuation than an intrinsic valuation. So that could be an illusion. We'll come back and talk about why, even though you might have fewer inputs, you're not getting away from the fundamentals just because you use a multiple and comparables. What are the disadvantages of relative valuation? As with discounted cash flow valuation, its advantages become its disadvantages. When you tell me that something is cheap on a relative value basis, be honest about what you're saying. You're not telling me it's cheap. You're saying, given these 15 other companies I've compared it to, this company looks cheap. You're making a relative statement. You're saying, so what? If all 16 of those companies were overvalued, what have you found for me? The least overvalued company. Relative valuation is a much weaker statement than intrinsic valuation because it's based first on the company you're looking at and the companies you compare it to, and it's a much narrower statement. Second, that assumption that markets are right in the collectively is an assumption that underlies relative value. So if markets make big mistakes across entire groups of stocks, you're going to feed it into your relative valuation. I'll tell you a business where all valuation is relative valuation. It's the real estate business. There is no intrinsic value. They maintain the illusion that there's intrinsic valuation because they give you these cash flows, but the cap rate they use is based on other transactions. And because everything is relative valuation, real estate goes through more booms and busts than any other business because everybody overvalues everything and everybody undervalues everything, and they have no sense of what the fair value is because they fight the notion of intrinsic value. So if we get a chance, we'll come back and talk about if we were redesigning real estate valuation, how would we do it to bring in at least an element of intrinsic valuation so we know when you have a bubble in real estate. And as I said, when you make those use a multiple and comparables, you are making implicit assumptions. Know what I'm talking about? If you tell me I'm valuing a company at 22 times EBITDA, I can actually take the 22 times EBITDA and tell you, you're assuming a 30% growth rate. You're saying, I'm not making any assumptions about growth. You are. Every time you use a multiple, you're making implicit assumptions about cash flows and growth and risk. And one of the things we're going to talk about through the relative valuation sessions is finding a way to make those implicit assumptions into explicit ones. So having said all of this, here's where relative valuation works best. It works best if you have a large number of comparable assets, which are priced, and we can control for differences. Have you ever used this site, SeatGeek.com? Anybody use the site? Somebody gave me the site last year. It's a site where they aggregate all these ticket sites, like StubHub. So it's brought together. But what makes SeatGeek? Try it out after class today. You go in, for instance, look for a Giants game ticket, or a Jets game, or World Series, or whatever you look for. Okay? It actually puts a stadium up, and you see lots of these big, circles drawn, and you see big green circles, small yellow circles. The big green circles are the best deals, and then the circles get smaller. So how do they come? They actually just compare the prices of all the seats in the section to each other. It's relative valuation at its purest, because they take two seats next to each other that two different people are selling. One person is selling it for 60, the other person is selling for 90. The 60 is a much better deal than the 90. That is pure relative valuation. I wish we could do this for stocks. StockGeek.com. You click on it. I mean, maybe I'm planting an idea. If you can find a way to do that, where you can basically take the problem with stocks is finding comparable stocks is much more difficult. It's not like a seat at a stadium, right? So it's much more difficult, but if you can do it, that's basically what relative valuation is all about. And what kind of investor would you have to be to use relative valuation? First, I can accept a much shorter time horizon from you. So if you have because it takes less time for markets to correct relative mistakes and intrinsic valuation mistakes. Why? If you have a stock trading at 5 times earnings in a sector where everything else trades at 25 times earnings, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Much quicker to adjust. And if you're judged on a relative basis and you're pricing, you're asked to price something, then value something, relative valuation is right for you. So here's a question I'm going to pose today. And this might again sound unfair because you said, I've not done any valuation yet. All I've heard is this 20-minute summary of valuation approaches. Go with your instincts right now. Given what I described about discounted cash flow valuation, relative valuation, and given what you see as your time horizon, where you're going to be working and what you're going to be doing, I'd like you to pick a valuation approach that you think fits right now. And at the end of this class, I'm going to come back with the same choice, and let's see if the next 14 weeks changes your perception. What I'm trying to say is a lot of people in this class, if they've never done valuation, start out with the presumption that because discounted cash flow valuation is exalted in theory, that everybody talks about is the right way to do things, that that's what you're going to like doing as well. But after you've spent the next 10 weeks actually doing a discounted cash flow valuation, you might change your mind. And be open to changing your mind, because there is no good approach and bad approach. They're just different approaches, and which one you pick will depend on your makeup as an individual and what you're doing the valuation for. What's your job? What are you required to do? Any questions? Let me mop up here. The third and final approach to doing valuation is to basically take option pricing models and apply them to value assets. The essence of option pricing is you have a payoff that is contingent on something happening. So in a classic listed option, the stock price, if it's a call option, the stock price has to exceed the strike price for you to get paid off. It's a contingent payoff. Usually options have finite lives. They don't last forever. But the best way to think about options actually is in terms of a payoff diagram, right? Options are fairly unique payoff diagrams, and if you've taken any finance class, at least you've seen this diagram. There's a call option, there's a put option. What makes options unique is the fact that you have limited losses on one side and potentially unlimited profits on the other. The put, of course, there's a limit because the price can't go below zero, but it's that asymmetric payoff that makes an option an option. See, where's this going? When we talk about options and valuation, you're going to see me try to draw payoff diagrams on a patent, on a natural resource option, because I'm looking to see whether the diagram I get looks like this. And if it does, I don't care what they call it. There's an option in there that I've got to value. I'll also tell you that I'm not interested in valuing conventional options. I don't care about valuing listed options, CVRs. I mean, there are lots of options out there that are traded, that are priced. Why? Because there's a different class. There's a futures and options class. We've got plenty of stuff on valuing or pricing listed options, traded options. The options we're going to talk about are a little more, I was going to say interesting, but that suggests that I think these are uninteresting. Maybe I do. Yeah? But they're more exotic. So here are some of the examples of the options we're going to talk about. You've been tracking what's been happening to Nokia? Stock price? The company's basically collapsed. Down to what? $2, down from like $50, $20, $25. And it doesn't look like there's much of a future out there, right? Like a lot of people saying this is the end. Research in motion, this is the end. Say, why would people buy stock in these dead-end technology companies? Because you might be buying an option. What's the option? There is a chance that Nokia could see a rebirth. It's happened to other companies before. And if it gets a rebirth, that $2 could become $25. Equity in deeply troubled companies. And here's what makes these companies deeply troubled. They're losing money. They've been losing money for a while, and they could keep losing money for the foreseeable future. And to add to the problem, there's a lot of debt on them. They're saying this is getting from bad to worse. We'll talk about why you're okay with it, and if it's a risky company, even better. So you want a risky, money-losing company with a lot of debt. This is like playing Russian roulette. Okay? You're buying an option. I'm going to argue that sometimes when you value natural resource companies, oil companies, gold mining companies, a portion of the value takes on the characteristics of an option. I'll give you an example. Petrobras, largest market cap company in Latin America. Oil company, $150 billion. Saying, what's the big deal? Lots of big oil companies around the world. What makes Petrobras unique and very different from Exxon, Mobil, or Conoco is about 70 to 80% of Petrobras' value does not come from the oil that they produce, but from oil reserves that they potentially could exploit. For the last decade, everywhere Petrobras looks, it seems to find oil. Maybe they're lying about the whole thing. We don't know. But the bulk of the value comes from, you're saying, what's the big deal? When you have oil reserves, especially when these reserves might be deep under the ocean, might cost you $30, $40, $50 to get. This is in Saudi Arabia. You stick your finger in the sand, oil comes out. This could cost you $40 a barrel. You're getting an option. Do you see why it's an option? If oil prices go down to $25 a barrel, what's the value of those reserves? Nothing. If they go to 100, they could be worth a lot. You're buying an option when you buy Petrobras, and the option is on oil, whether you like it or not. Pharmaceutical companies, technology companies. In fact, a big news set of news stories. You've seen a company selling their entire patent, library to another company. Eastman Kodak just did it. AOL did it. When you buy a patent, what are you buying? You're buying an option. Why? Because a patent gives you the right to develop a product. It does not give you an obligation. A patent can expire worthless. It can be worth a lot. So we're going to argue that patents, at least in some forms, take on the characteristics of an option. And finally, here's the fuzziest of all options, the scariest of all options. When you look at Indian companies and Chinese companies, you see high values attached to them. Especially when they're not making much money. And you ask, why is that? What's the answer you get? There are lots of people there. Right? Basically, the option is, think of the size of that market. If they could become successful in that market, think of how much money they could make. Now, that argument can be pushed beyond its limit, but you're talking about an option there. When you buy these companies, there's an option to expand into this potentially huge market that you're paying this price for. You can actually make the same argument for Facebook, right? When that $100 billion market cap was attached to Facebook, what was the rationale given for it? It wasn't that they were making enough money to justify the $100 billion market cap. The number that I saw thrown around was $1 billion. Billion what? 1 billion users. Billion users doing what? Not much right now. Just talking to each other, But you're hoping that if you can somehow sell them stuff, think of how much money you could make. You're buying an option with Facebook. And that's why I don't understand this sudden shift from, you bought an option in February. It's still an option in September. So what's changed between those 9 months that somehow made you realize that this option is worth nothing? And the reason I think we need to bring option pricing models into the discussion is there are some businesses, some assets that can be valued only as options. A deeply troubled company, for instance, if you do a discounted cash flow valuation, you're probably going to come up with a very low value. Why? Because the cash flows are all negative. You try to do a relative valuation. What's the trouble you're going to run into? It's a deeply troubled company. It's negative earnings, negative EBITDA. The only number you might have that's positive is revenue, so getting any multiple to work is. So companies like those, the only technique that might work is option pricing. But here's the real reason why I think we need to think about option pricing. Unlike with every other valuation approach, when I increase risk, what happens to the value of an asset? In a discounted cash flow model, when I increase risk, what changes? The discount rate goes up, the value goes down. In relative valuation, I compare a safe company to a risky company. The risky company trades at a lower P. But when you think of an asset as an option, and I up the risk in the asset, what happens to the value of an option when risk goes up? It goes up. And why? Why is risk your ally with options when it's not your ally with traditional assets? What makes options unique? Think about that payoff diagram. What was the nice feature of the payoff diagram? You had limited. In fact, when you think about risk, what's the kind of risk that worries you? Upside risk or downside risk? None of us goes, oh my God, I have so much upside risk in this. It's a downside risk that bothers you, right? And with options, I've kind of cut it off. You're saying, so what? What did I say Petrobras's value came from? It came from that option you got on oil, right? So if oil prices become much more volatile, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It depends. If you're looking at ExxonMobil, it might be a risky asset, so you're saying it's worth less. But if you're looking at Petrobras, that higher variance in oil now could push up the value of all those undeveloped reserves and make them more valuable. So it gives you that line where risk suddenly goes from being a bad thing to a good thing. So even if you never, ever use an option pricing model to value something, recognizing that there's an optionality in there gives you that added oomph to the value. I bought Nokia 3 weeks ago, and Nokia is one of the stocks I'm going to put a valuation on and let you deal with it. And when I justified my acquisition of Nokia, I bought it when it hit $2. I said, look, I'm not optimistic about its future. I think it's going to die. Sounds like a strange way to justify a buy. And by the way, it has a lot of debt, and it's very risky. That's why I'm buying. So I see no hope. I see a lot of... But you can see why, as an option, that lots of risk works in my favor. And why the debt is actually a good thing rather than a bad thing. How does debt help you? The value of the asset is volatile. If the debt is a large number, the value of your equity is going to become even more. So if you're already saying, look, you're drowning, what does it matter whether you drown in 50 feet of water or 10 feet of water? Basically, that's what you're doing. You're buying a deep underwater company saying, I want upside here, and I want upside that comes with the downside. I don't worry about the downside because I've kind of given up on that end. When you think about an asset as an option, it changes the way you think about that asset. What are the disadvantages of option pricing models? The biggest disadvantage with the real options area are the people who practice it. They're purists. Basically, they want to apply their neat little option pricing models, and everywhere they look, they see options. But let's face it, when we start applying conventional option pricing models to real options, we're stretching the technology almost to breaking point. What am I talking about? When you take a Black-Scholes option pricing model, and you value an option using an option pricing model, you assume the variance is constant over the life of the option, right? You think, what's the big deal? It's not a big deal if you're valuing a listed option with 2 months to expiration, but if you're valuing oil reserves at Petrobras as an option for the next 25 years, it's a much more dangerous assumption. So when we use option pricing models, sometimes you run into this issue of how much can I bend these models without breaking them? And here's the other thing. To use option pricing models, you actually have to do a discounted cash flow valuation first. It's a starting point. It's not an alternative to discounted cash flow valuation. It's an addendum. It's an add-on. One of the dangers of real options, at least as I see it, is a lot of analysts have become very fond of real options. Why? Because it allows them to add premiums onto value. So they'll value a pharmaceutical company, come up with a value and say, but there's a real option here. Why? Because I read about patents being options, I'm going to add another 30%. But if you look at their actual valuation, they've used a much higher growth rate in the valuation to capture the fact that this company already has a patent which might become you can't double count. So we'll talk about how to bring in real options into valuation, but at the same time make sure that it doesn't get double counted in that final number. So discounted cash flow valuation, relative valuation. So try this as an exercise. See, find a valuation model out there. See if you can classify it. Is it a discounted? And you're going to see that there are some very strange models that masquerade as discounted cash flow valuation models, but really are not. You know why? Because the biggest number in the model comes from using a multiple, the terminal value. So take a look at these models, see if you can classify them, and try to keep an open mind. In other words, don't shut your mind off after the discounted cash flow valuation. This is all I need to know. I don't care about multiples. I think to do valuation well, you need to be comfortable with all three approaches. So I'm going to try to set my biases to the side and try to be as open as I can be in explaining and talking about these approaches. But I'd like you to try to stay with me on that ride and make it, at the end of the process, you can decide whatever you want, but at least do it based on full information. Any questions on valuation approaches? So let's get the ball rolling on the first pack. So if you don't have it, don't worry about it. As I said, you can just look at the slides when you get a chance. But when you get a chance, do buy the packet or print it off or do whatever you need to do. Right? Talked about intrinsic value. The essence of intrinsic value is you believe that every asset has a value. That asset value is based on its cash flows, how uncertain you feel about those cash flows, and what the growth in those cash flows is. File those away because those are three words you're going to see popping up again and again in this cash flows. Cash flows, growth, and risk. They're going to drive everything we talk about in valuation. And when you say discounted cash flow valuation, it is the most widely used tool for intrinsic valuation, but it's not the only one. So if I get a chance, I'll talk about variants on discounted cash flow valuation, including accounting book value valuation, excess return valuation, but they're all approaches we try to estimate intrinsic value. As I said, there's very little theory in discounted cash flow valuation, but here are the two phases of discounted cash flow valuation. The most common phase of discounted cash flow valuation, you take the expected cash flows. Notice I said expected, not conservative estimates of cash flows, not optimistic, expected cash flows, and you discount them back at a risk-adjusted discount rate. It's the conventional way we do valuation. So how do we come up with expected cash flows? If this were a statistics class, what would be the process we use to come up with expected cash flows next year? We'd develop different scenarios for the company, from worst case to best case. We'd estimate the cash flows for each scenario. Then we take probabilities and take an expected value. Do you think anybody ever does that in actual valuation? Nobody ever does that, but implicitly that's what we're supposed to do, is come up with an expected cash flow across all scenarios and discount that expected cash flow at a risk-adjusted discount rate. There's another way in which discounted cash flow valuation can be done. It's not done very often, but sometimes you'll see this version. Rather than use expected cash flows, I could use what I call certainty equivalent cash flows. You say, what the heck are those? Let me give you an example. Let's suppose you're planning to invest in Venezuela. And I'll make this a very simple investment. 90% of the time you're going to make $100, and 10% of the time Hugo Chavez is going to take away your company, you're going to make nothing. What's your expected cash flow? 90% of $100 is $90, so your expected cash flow is 90. That's what you would use in a discounted cash flow model. You take that 90 and discount that back at a risk-adjusted discount rate. Here's what a certainty equivalent cash flow is. The certainty equivalent cash flow is a cash flow you will accept in exchange for that $90, but it's a cash flow that's guaranteed. It's the guaranteed cash flow you would need to replace it. So let me ask, the follow-up to that is, would that cash flow have to be lower or higher than $90? It would be lower. How much lower? It depends on how risk-averse you are. So if you're not that risk-averse, you might say, I'll take 88. In fact, if you're risk-neutral, then you just take the 90. The more risk-averse you are, that's what a certainty equivalent is. We'll talk about techniques to come up with certainty equivalents, because clearly you can't go around asking investors, what would you take as your certainty equivalent for Procter & Gamble's cash flow next year? But with certainty equivalent cash flows, that's what you're doing. You're going in with each expected cash flow and adjusting it for the risk in that cash flow. And because you've risk-adjusted the cash flows, and that's what risk adjustment means, you would discount those cash flows back at a risk-free rate. Don't double count. You can't adjust the cash flow for risk and adjust the discount rate for risk. So those are the two phases of discounted cash flow valuation. Okay? Again, the reason I'm bringing this up is people play games with cash flows. They claim to have risk-adjusted the cash flows, and they've done nothing of the kind. In fact, if anybody tells you that they've risk-adjusted the cash flows, ask them a very simple question. What exactly did you do? And here's what they will say. Well, I took the bad scenarios and I took the good scenarios. I put cash flows in each one. I attached a probability. That's not risk-adjusting the cash flow. That's what you're supposed to do to get an expected cash flow. Risk-adjusting the cash flow requires more. So the value of an asset then is the present value of your expected cash flows in that asset over the life of the asset. It's an equation, right? Very simple equation. You take that equation apart and state two propositions, both of which are obvious, but I might as well set them on the table. For an asset to have value in this equation, its cash flow has to be positive at some point in time. Stating the obvious, I might as well state it, right? I talked about the half a dozen emails I get every week from people claiming to have built a better model to value cash. I get at least 1 or 2 each week from people who value companies. And here's how the emails will go. I'm valuing a money-losing company. I expect it to keep losing money forever. Which valuation model should I use to value this company? To which you feel like slapping the person and wake up. You have a money-losing company, expect to lose money forever. Why are you paying for this company? They should pay you. But let's extend that proposition out. Let's say you're valuing a company and your cash flow in year 1 is a big negative number. Your cash flow in year 2 is a big negative number. You're going to give up and say, that's a bad company, I'm not going to. Is it possible to have a valuable company where the cash flows up front are big negative numbers? What kinds of companies do you think you're going to see that? Startups, young growth companies, because they have to invest. It's not even that they're losing money, but that they have to invest so much to get growth. It could be infrastructure companies where you have to invest up front to get the cash flows. So you can have negative cash flows up front, but here's the catch. If you have $1 billion in negative cash flows in year 1, you need to have a disproportionately large positive cash flow in the future to make up for it. Why? Because there's time value for money. So if you lose $1 billion in year 1, you better make $10 billion in year 10. And that's what you're looking for in growth companies. It's not, are they losing money right now? Of course they are. Do they have negative cash flows right now? Absolutely. But are they making enough in cash flows in the future to compensate you for those negative cash flows up front? So I'm going to use a device we used in corporate finance to frame the way we think about valuation. Remember the financial balance sheet? Even if you don't, here's a very simple review of the financial balance sheet. Unlike an accounting balance sheet where we clutter up the balance sheet with all kinds of stuff, a financial balance sheet at one level is far simpler. Another level is far more complex. On the asset side of the balance sheet, of a financial balance sheet, you have only 2 assets, 2 items. Assets in place, which should be investments you've already made as a company. So if you're talking about Procter & Gamble, here's where you put all their existing products. That's my assets in place. Growth assets are investments I expect you to make next year, 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, 50 years out. I'm giving you credit for investments you haven't even thought about yet. See, that's weird. Why would you do that? You buy stock in a growth company. What are you paying for? You're not paying for what they've already done. You're paying for perceptions, expectations. With most growth companies, that's where the bulk of your value comes from. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just there. Might as well be aware of it. So when you buy LinkedIn, 80, 90, 95% of your value could come from growth assets. When you buy Coca-Cola, 80% of your value could come from assets in place. As an investor, it's good to know what you're buying. And on the other side of the balance sheet, there are only 2 ways you can fund a business. You can borrow money or use your own money. You can slice this and dice this as much as you want, but there's only debt and equity. Whenever I sit down to value a company, I try to take that accounting balance sheet and simplify it into a financial balance sheet. And here's why it works. There are 2 ways you can do valuation. In the first, you wear blinders. You care only about valuing equities. I'm going to focus just on the equity investors. I'm going to look at what they get as cash flows and discount it back at a rate of return they demand as equity investors. That's called equity valuation. Or you can say, look, I'm not interested in just the equity. I'm going to value the entire business. It's a decision you got to make early in the process. Are you valuing equity or are you valuing the business? Because every input you come up with in valuation is going to be colored by that choice. So let me back up what I mean by this. When you think about valuing equity, you're focusing on the cash flows that equity investors get. Cash flows that equity investors get are the cash flows left over after they've met every conceivable need, capital expenditures, working capital, debt payments, interest payments. You make all those cash flows, what's left over is the cash flow to equity. You discount those cash flows back at the cost of equity. Sounds like a fancy term, right? You know what the cost of equity is? It's the rate of return that equity investors had in their minds when they bought your stock. They bought your stock. They thought, I'll make 12%, 14%. I think that's going to be a nightmare to estimate. You're absolutely right. You've got to be a mind reader to estimate the cost of equity. But even if you're a mind reader, there's a second problem. You value a company like Cisco with thousands of stockholders. Whose mind are you going to read? We'll come back and grapple with that question. But let's assume you can come up with that cost of equity. Cash flows to equity discounted back at the cost of equity is the value of an equity stake in a business. And if this is a publicly traded company, isn't there a much simpler way to estimate cash flow to equity? What's the only tangible cash flow you get as a stockholder in a publicly traded company? Dividends. The dividend discount model is a special case of an equity valuation model. Why is it a special case? Because I'm assuming companies are paying out what they can afford to pay out in dividends. And we know conclusively, without even a hint of doubt, that companies don't pay out what they can afford to in dividends. How do we know that conclusively? What gives them away? If you ask CFOs of companies, you ask the CFO of Apple, are you paying out what you can afford to in dividends? You know what he's going to say? At least until last year. Yes, every last penny. And we know he's lying because all we need to do is look at his balance sheet and what do we see? $100 billion in cash. Big cash balances are not manna from heaven. They don't pop up on your balance sheet. They're the direct consequence of you choosing not to pay out what you can afford to in dividends. I'm not even saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying if you focus on dividends and dividends alone, and companies don't pay out what they can afford to in dividends, you know what the follow-up to that is going to be, right? You're going to come up with values for companies that are too low. Now, you might be a conservative investor and say, that's what I'm going to use, but it's not a fair valuation of the company. So what choice do we have? You can estimate what a company could have paid out in dividends. It's not rocket science. How do I define what you could pay out? What's left over after every conceivable need is met, right? You go to the statement of cash flows, I can back out for any company what a company could have paid out in dividends. So in corporate finance we call the free cash flow equity, but think of it as potential dividend. We'll come back and address how to come up with that number. You discount that cash flow back at the cost of equity, you have a value of equity in a business. The alternative is to value the whole business. There are equity investors who get cash flows equity, right? Who's the other player in the game? Lenders. Do they get cash flows from the business? What are the cash flows that lenders get from the business? They get interest payments and principal repayments, right? They might grant you new debt, but cash flows to debt also come from the business. Collectively, what both groups get out of the business, cash flow to equity plus cash flow to debt, is called the cash flow to the firm. And if that's the cash flow I'm discounting, remember with cash flow to equity, I focus on cost of equity. If I'm discounting the collective cash flow you get, then the discount rate I use should be a weighted average of what the equity investors want, which is the cost of equity, and what the lenders want, which is the cost of debt, which of course in corporate finance is the cost of capital. Cash flows to the business, discounted back at the cost of capital, gives me the value of the entire business. If I'm still interested in equity, can I get there? Once I value the business, what do I need to do? I need to subtract out what I owe to the lenders, and I should have the value for the equity. Those of you who've done discounted cash flow valuation have done this pretty much in every valuation. Value the business, you subtract out debt. So I'm going to ask you a question, and this is a question that we'll come back and deal with in detail, but those of you who've done DC evaluation, at least give me a guess on what you think the answer is. To get from the value of the business to the value of equity, which of the following would you need to do? Subtract out the value of long-term debt, subtract out the value of all debt, subtract out the value of any debt that was included as debt in your cost of capital, or subtract out the value of all liabilities. I've seen all four done in DCF valuations. So I'm throwing all four out saying, your job is to get from the value of the business to value of equity. Which of those four definitions of debt do you think I should use? Long-term debt, total debt, whatever you call debt in your cost of capital, or all current liabilities, or all liabilities, which include current accounts payable, supply, credit, etc. Let's start ruling things out. Do you think you should ever use all liabilities? Why not? Are we ignoring accounts payable and supply credit? How are they entering your valuation? Through what item? They're going to enter in through the working capital and through the cash flows. So it really becomes a choice of long-term debt, total debt, or whatever debt you have. You think, what do you mean, whatever debt you have in your cost of capital? Isn't that always going to be one of the two? Well, you might treat leases as debt, right? And if you do that in your cost of capital, then you have to treat that as debt when you subtract. So basically, whatever you call debt in your cost of capital is going to revisit your valuation now to get out from the value of the firm to get a value of equity. So if you've treated leases as debt to get to the cost of capital, you have to subtract out the value of leases. It keeps your valuations, again, consistent. I don't like the use of long-term debt and cost of capital, but if that's what you define as debt, just long-term debt, then that's what you would subtract out to get to the value of equity. But then you'd have to mop up. What are you going to do with short-term debt? Are you going to put it in working capital? You can't ignore items from your balance sheet. They can't go away. They've got to be somewhere in your valuation. And let's assume you do subtract out the right debt. You're going to come up with the value of equity, right? You could have also valued the equity directly in this company by taking cash flowed equity and discounting the cost of equity. I have two different questions. Same company, you can value the equity two ways. By valuing equity directly or valuing the business and subtracting out debt. Would you like to get the same answer for equity with the two approaches? You see why if you get different values, you're going to be in deep trouble? Can you imagine as an equity research analyst putting out a recommendation saying, I got a buy recommendation based on my equity valuation and a sell recommendation based on my firm. You would like the numbers to be the same, right? Do you think you're going to get the right answer? In fact, when you value a company, try this as an exercise. Value using firm, subtract out debt, come up with the value of equity, then try an equity valuation approach. I guarantee you will not get the same answer the first time you do it. And one of the challenges of this class is try to figure out why those numbers are different. I told you there's going to be a weekly challenge every week. This week's weekly challenge that goes out on Wednesday is going to give you a very simple valuation. You don't have to worry about big growth rates and all that stuff. And I'm going to give you two different valuations for your company, one with a direct equity model, one with a firm model. And then I'm going to ask you why the answer is different. And I want you to start digging, because if you start understanding the basis of those differences, you're starting to understand the implicit assumptions we made in discounted cash flow valuation. That's it for today. So make sure if you're not in a group that you let me know by the end of today. So I'm going to start putting that list together. Okay? And if you haven't picked a company, please do.